All right, welcome to today's webinar, Creating a Comprehensive Statement of Special Education Aids and Services within the IEP. Today's webinar is hosted by the Progress Center at the American Institutes for Research. We are an Office of Special Education Programs funded center aimed at promoting progress for students with disabilities. My name is Tessie Rose Bailey, and I am the director of the Progress Center. The center was funded in 2019 to provide information, resources, tools, and technical assistance to support local educators in developing and implementing high-quality educational programming. Now, to support local educators, we share things like guidance and tools. We have resources, and they're all based on existing research, state and federal law and policy, as well as local experiences. We also partner with a select group of local educators to develop their knowledge, skills, and infrastructure to promote progress for students with disabilities. And we also seek their feedback about how we can improve our supports and our resources. Now, the center was developed in response to the Indirects Supreme Court decision. And that decision states that an individualized education program or an IEP must be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Now, under the IDEA, the IEP serves as the foundation of promoting progress for students with disabilities. And over the last year, we have released a number of tip sheets, online modules, and webinars to really support educators in the development of the individualized educational plan or program. And so to ensure that students do receive free, appropriate public education or FAPE, and improved outcomes for students with disabilities, the Progress Center, as you'll see on the next slide, supports educators in the development and implementation of that programming. And as I mentioned before, that well-designed IEP outlines the supports and services that are necessary to promote progress towards those ambitious goals. Now, we know that for students to really benefit, that we have to have programming that's delivered with a high degree of fidelity, using evidence-based and high leverage practices. Now, today's webinar is part of a larger series of trainings and resources to support local educators in both the development as well as the implementation of that programming. Now, before we get started, we just want to learn a little bit about you. And so we'd like you to take a moment to respond to our very simple poll question. And it asks, what is your current role that has led you to learn more about the Statement of Special Education, Services, and Aids for students with disabilities within the IEP? So you'll see a number of options are available for you. So are you a special ed teacher, general ed teacher, maybe you're a service provider? And we do have in the chat box, if you click other to make sure that you tell us who you are or what role you play in your school. We're really looking forward to that interaction. All right, we have some parent mentors. We have a lot of TA staff, interpreters, SLPs. Great. All right, so let's see our poll responses. We have some directors. Great, so if you look at our responses, you'll see that most folks, we have a lot of faculty members or professional development providers. We do have some administrators and special education teachers on the call. So if you do have any questions as we're moving through this, please use the chat box. You can use the Q&A if you want to do that anonymously, or you can use the chat box if you'd like just an immediate response, or you want to open your questions up to other folks within the session. So we're so glad that you're able to join us. We have a couple of objectives that we're trying to achieve today. First, we want to make sure we explain IDEA's definition for the Statement of Special Education Aids and Services. And it might be surprising to you that what we often think about as 4 different parts of the IEP really fall under a single statement under the Federal Act. We're also going to clarify and provide some examples of special education related services and supplementary aids and services, as well as program modifications and supports, which make up that statement. And we're going to share some tips and resources for developing that comprehensive needs-based statement by an IEP team. Now, as a reminder, we can only share so much in our short period of time. So if you are looking for additional guidance and professional learning, we're going to share a number of resources at the end of today's session that can help you learn more about that. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our primary speaker today, Stephen Prater. He serves as a TA provider for the Progress Center. For almost 20 years, he has worked at the state and local level in general and special education. Now, prior to joining the center, he led a project for the state of Texas in partnership with the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and it focused on training school and district staff on the use of database individualization. He is a former secondary math teacher, a licensed specialist in school psychology, a campus administrator, and a manager of a technical assistance project in special education at TEA. All right, welcome, Stephen.
All right, thank you very much. Glad to be here, everybody. Thank you. Like Tessie said, I'm a technical assistance provider for the Progress Center. So, but before we start our presentation or my presentation, we do have a video that we want to show. This video is from one of our educators in residence, Amanda Finley. She's a national board certified teacher. She received her master's in teaching from the University of Washington. She's been a teacher in a private school setting and spent over a decade as an elementary resource room teacher in a public school. She's been a mentor teacher for general and special education teachers, and she's been a supervising teacher to student teachers. Currently, she works in a transition program. And so she's going to explain how her and her team approaches writing the statement of services and aids.
So when I am writing the statements of special education related services and supplementary aids and services, I will include within the present levels of performance separate statements of what's being provided within each area in which the student receives services. For example, if a student receives specially designed instruction in adaptive skills, I will state that the student is receiving specially designed instruction in that area, outline where the service occurs and how often it's occurring. And the related service providers write a similar statement in their particular areas within the present levels of performance. For supplementary aids and services, such as one-to-one support, I'll include that in each area of the present levels where it would be relevant and required. When I'm writing the comprehensive statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services, I want that to be as clear and concise as possible while also incorporating all of the necessary elements. And I then include that statement within each area of the present levels of performance. This is a practice that's required for our safety net IEPs, and now I carry it over into all of my IEPs. So an example of that would be, as a result of such and such's variety of needs resulting from their such and such disability, they qualify for and require specially designed instruction in the areas of adaptive skills, functional academics, vocational skills, and speech. Qualifies for and requires related services in the areas of occupational therapy and physical therapy, and qualifies for and requires supplementary aid and service of one-to-one assistance with activities of daily living, safety, and mobility within the classroom and in the community. So when I'm writing these statements, I like to collaborate with the other service providers to make sure that I'm capturing everything that the student needs and that it sounds clear and concise and that I'm not missing anything. To help me with this, I went to the IRIS Center. That's a great resource. And I also used the IEP tip sheets from the Progress Center. So those are two really great resources if you need help writing your comprehensive statement.
All right, so now as federal law, all states must ensure that their schools and districts meet the minimum criteria or minimum requirements outlined in IDEA, but many states do go above and beyond, and they establish additional requirements for the IEP. They can add a shorter timeline, or maybe they have additional components, but we'll be focusing on the minimum requirements outlined in IDEA. And we really encourage you to check with your state department to see if there are other additional requirements and procedures that you must also follow. So in the chat box, we'll put a link to an interactive map that allows you to click and to find your state's department to look for more information. All right, so did you know that the Progress Center has a whole tip sheet series just on the Statement of Services Aids and its components? So all the information that I'm going to cover today is going to come from these tip sheets. But if you search for them on your own, you're going to see they provide additional information, including examples, questions to consider, tips for implementation, and additional resources to explore. You can find them on our website, which is promotingprogress.org. So a link will also be added to the chat box. All right, so IDEA indicates that the Statement of Services and Aids in a child's IEP must describe these 4 parts that will be provided to or on behalf of the child: special education and related services, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications or supports. So many people think of these as separate components of the IEP, like Tessie was talking about earlier, but each piece must be coordinated and connected to the others to form one cohesive statement developed by the IEP team using student data. So on the next slide, we'll talk about what the purpose of the statement is. The reason the statement must be coordinated and cohesive is to help the child advance appropriately toward attaining their annual goals, be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, participate in extracurricular and other non-academic activities, and be educated and participate with other children with and without disabilities. So having a coordinated and cohesive statement makes the sum of the statement greater than the parts. So I've mentioned a couple of times now about how the Statement of Services and Aids includes 4 parts that must be developed by the IEP team based on data, and these parts need to work in concert with each other. So when we develop IEPs, we have to consider the student's experience, which extends beyond just the special education services. So for example, supplementary aids and services and program modifications are necessary for success in general education, while special education and related services are necessary for success in special education and general education. So the Statement of Services and Aids should account for all of the special education and related services, the supplementary aids and services, and the program modifications and supports that a student needs. So all of these services and aids come together as one complete statement to help a child to make progress on their goals and in the general education curriculum, and to participate in activities and with their peers. So according to IDEA, specially designed instruction, or SDI, means adapting the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of a child that result from their disability and ensure their access to the general curriculum. All right, so let's take a look at what we mean by content, methodology, and delivery of instruction. So content refers to what is taught to the student. Methodology is how the instruction is given, so the practices and the approach the teacher uses. And the delivery of instruction is the who, the where, and the when the instruction is delivered. So here are some examples on the screen of SDI. So it can be specialized instruction conducted in a classroom, a home, hospital, institution, or other setting, specialized instruction in physical education, travel training, vocational education, or speech and language pathology services, or any other related services that is counted as a special education service. So we'll talk more about related services here in a minute. Okay, so what does IDEA say about related services? So related services refer to transportation and other developmental, corrective, and other supportive services that are required to assist a child to benefit from special education. So there's many services that can be considered related services. So here's a few common ones. Again, you see the speech and language pathology there, interpreting services, psychological services, physical and occupational therapy, and then some of those listed there. Those are the main ones you would see at a school. And on the next slide, you're going to see some more examples of other common types of related services: counseling services, transportation, orientation and mobility services, parent counseling and training, and some other ones listed here. So the tip sheets over related service, or the tip sheet over related services, goes into more details about each of these services. So the third component we're going to go over is the supplementary aids and services. So according to IDEA, this refers to aids, services, and other supports to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. So notice that it states that these aids and services are provided in the regular education classes, other education-related settings, and in extracurricular and non-academic settings. So some examples of supplementary aids and services are instructional accommodations, modifications, testing accommodations, and other aids and services. All right, so let's take a closer look at each of these types of supplementary aids and services. Instructional accommodations change the delivery of the instruction or the accompanying materials, but they don't change what the student learns. So this can be things like large print books, special seating, or extended time for assignments. But modifications, on the other hand, do change what a student is expected to learn or what a test is expected to measure. So examples of modifications would be students learning different content or not required to complete similar materials as their peers. Testing accommodations, similar to instructional accommodations, they just change the format or the administration procedures of a test, but not what it measures. So examples of this would be having the test read aloud or testing in a small group setting. So it's important to align testing and instructional accommodations. For example, if the student needs a test read aloud, then they'll also need classroom assignments and quizzes read aloud. So you want the student to be familiar with and use the accommodation successfully in the classroom before they use it on a test. Other aids and services that could be considered supplementary aids and services are having a healthcare assistant, a peer tutor, assistive technology services, or one-on-one aid. All right, so lastly, let's talk about the program modifications and supports. So although IDEA doesn't define program modifications and supports for school personnel, each child's IEP must contain the program modifications or supports for school personnel that will enable the child to advance appropriately towards attaining their goals, their annual goals, be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and be educated and participate with other children with and without disabilities. So these are the things that are going to help teachers be most prepared to support students. So some examples of program modifications and supports include training for staff and parents to support implementation, special equipment or resources for providing instruction and supports, and collaborative planning time between the general education teacher, the special education teacher, and the related service providers. So on this slide, you're going to see some questions to consider when the IEP team is determining if and what program modifications and supports are needed. So for program modifications, you want to think about, are there modifications to the physical classroom environment or to the school schedule or program that are necessary? For program supports, you want to think about, is there professional learning or training needed for school personnel or families? Is there special equipment or materials that are necessary? Are there additional support from other staff or administrators necessary? Or does the teacher need additional support in the classroom, such as having an aide? All right, so now that we've gone over these four components of the statement of services and aids, so here's some tips to help choose and implement those necessary supports. So number one, ensure that the PLAF statement justifies the services and aids to be provided to the student. So everything should connect back to that PLAF statement. It shouldn't just be something you decide on your own. The PLAF should describe what's needed and you connect those services to the PLAF. Avoid identifying specific programs and instead focus on the nature of the services and the supports. Number three there, make sure the aids and services are chosen based on the unique needs of the student and not based on a disability label or the location of the services. Number four, consider what knowledge and skills school personnel will need to successfully implement the IEP. Number five, when students are non-responsive to evidence-based programs, consider using a research-based process such as database individualization to individualize those supports. So the National Center for Intensive Intervention has many resources about database individualization on their websites if you want to check that out. And number six there, review the research and resources from the OSEP funded centers. So such as the Progress Center and the National Center for Intensive Intervention. So they offer free resources that are created and vetted by experts, and they are supported by evidence. All right, so now we want to hear from you. So which of the 4 components included in the statement of special education and services and aids does your team feel most confident with? So the special education, the related services, the supplementary aids and services, or the program modifications and supports. So if you just want to put your answer in the chat, that way we can kind of see and everybody can see how others are responding. So in the chat, just put which component that your team feels the most comfortable with. And I'm going to check the chat just to see what comes up here. All right, so our first brave soul said special education. We have related services coming up. We see somebody has trouble or they do not feel comfortable with the supplementary aids and services. All right, some more people feeling good about the special education part. All right, so I think let's go ahead and go to our next slide. I think it's going to talk about the ones that you feel least confident with. So which of the 4 components in the statement of special education and related services and aids is most challenging for your team? So is the special education, related services, somebody already mentioned supplementary aids and services, or the program modifications or support. So which part of the statement do you feel is the most challenging for your team? Go ahead and just put it in the chat, and that way we can see how everybody's responding. I see somebody put up program modification supports. I feel like that is kind of the one that's the most perplexing for IEP teams. What I've seen in schools is that's the one that's kind of left off to the side a little bit. So several people are putting program modifications and support. So don't feel alone. You see other people are having trouble with this too. So hopefully this is what we're going to help you with. So. All right, so that concludes my part of the presentation. I think we're going to turn over to Tessie and the panelists now. Thank y'all very much.
All right, thanks, Stephen. I'm just reading, yeah, if the child has an IEP, then something is already modified. And in some cases, it may be accommodated versus modified. And I think that's the challenge that we all see in our schools is, to what extent do we need to make those modifications in order for this student that we're working with to be successful? So what we're hoping to hear is from our distinguished panelists about what we just talked about looks like in the local context. It's really easy to break it down and say theoretically these are what the parts are, but as you saw in the chat box, there's always some areas that are a little more challenging than maybe some of the others. And so we have 5 amazing folks joining us today. Our first one is Bart, and I've known Bart for a long time, and he currently works at the Uinta County School District number 4 in Mountain View, Wyoming as a special education director. And he's got his bachelor's degree in business management with a minor in school psychology. And then additionally, when he became an educational specialist, got his educational specialist degree in school psych from BYU. As a University of Utah graduate, I'll let that one pass. He's done other postgraduate work as well in school neuropsychology, as well as educational leadership. And he has had a very extensive career that's generally been focused on the practices of school psychology, but he's also been an MTSS coach in his state and worked as an outreach program director for a regional BOCES. Andrea Boykin is a manager for assistive technology in the Division of Specialized Instruction in the Office of Teaching and Learning and Social Emotional Academic Development at the District of Columbia Public Schools. She is also an adjunct faculty member at GMU, or George Mason University. As a former special education teacher and researcher in the field of assistive technology, she's been using her experiences to really develop policy and procedures for assistive technology, which just falls under several of these parts that we'll talk about today, as well as supporting the decision-making and implementation of the assistive technology within the district she works. We're also joined by a team, kind of like a smaller version of the IEP team, and Nicole Bucka, who is also a Progress Center advisor and implementation specialist in Rhode Island, is also a parent and has been through this process actually on multiple sides. She began her career as a teacher in California. She's worked in special education, secondary English, English language development, evolving to hold a variety of leadership positions. From there, she moved to teacher training and administrative support. She has supported RTI technical assistance in the state of Rhode Island, as well as PBIS supports with social and emotional learning through a continuum of supports within an MTSS model. Now, her current role in MTSS implementation specialist, she supports state implementation of database individualization, which you heard Stephen mention, and contributes to the development and facilitation of online professional learning through what's called Bridge RI, which has some amazing online professional learning opportunities. She is a proud parent of 2 children with autism spectrum disorder. Now, Gianna Gray is joining her from her team. She works with Nicole. She is a licensed board certified behavior analyst in Rhode Island. She has been serving children and families with autism spectrum disorder since 2002 and started an agency called Ascent ABA LLC in 2020. And the purpose of that was to support those living with ASD. She graduated from Rhode Island College in 2009 with a bachelor's in psychology and then received her master's degree from the University of Massachusetts, Boston in 2012. And she is a dedicated person improving the lives of children and families that she works with, collaborating and learning, as you'll hear today, from other disciplines, as well as offering alternative ways in which we can deliver that ABA services. And finally, Emma Matrano is an ASHA certified speech and language pathologist. She received her bachelor's degree in communication disorders from the University of Rhode Island in 2015. And she's worked as a school-based SLP since graduating with a master's degree in SLP, or speech language pathology, from the Southern Connecticut State University in 2018. And she currently works as a 3rd through 5th grade elementary school and middle school life skills classroom teacher, supporting students with a variety of communication needs. I want to give our folks a round of applause, and you'll see there's a little emoticons that you might be able to use in the chat feature if you want to say hello. All right, so we'll put on our videos and great, thank you all. I'm so glad you're here. And so I actually want to start with our team because it's kind of rare that we have like an IEP team that's able to come together. And as you think about your work in developing this comprehensive statement based on everything you heard, how are you thinking about the 4 components when you develop it? And I'll pass this to Nicole first.
I think I'm unmuted, right? Thank you. I just wanted to say that, you know, my child, the one that we are a part of a team for, is very complex, nonverbal. He uses AAC. He needs behavioral supports. So I think he's probably on the further end of the spectrum as far as the needs. And, you know, I think that we really approach our team, we approach the IEP very much different than I think most teams do. And it really starts with a clear vision for where we want my son to get to, my husband and I, in life, and where he's at right now. And then we try to identify broad areas of need, like he needs to be able to communicate across all contexts with different people, right? So that he can engage in school and enjoy it. And so we think about those big goals like that. And then we start thinking about what would that look like entering the building? What would that look like in his first academic session? What would it look like in circle, in PE, at recess? And so you start mapping it out holistically around him as a child. And I think one of my teammates here said it, and I think that's very true, is a lot of parents don't know that they have the expertise of their child, but that their thoughts are actually really important to this process. They think that, they should come to the table and just, be very, you're the expert, you tell me. And, for better or for worse, that's not the approach I take. And I think that this is the approach that needs to be taken, is you have to come in as a team member.
So it sounds like, and I think Emma or Gianna can reinforce this if that's true, it sounds like this process of developing this statement starts well before the actual IEP meeting. Is that correct? And how do you guys go about preparing for this discussion around the statement? So Gianna?
Sure. Well, I think it's an evolving document, to Nicole's point, and I think everyone else is here, is that the IEP statement isn't written in the hour that you have at the IEP meeting. It's written over time. And with all of the different disciplines collaborating with one another, it's helpful for us to really learn one another's approach while, operating within our scope of practice, but trying to learn as much as possible. And that happens over time, especially with unique learners.
Emma?
I agree with everything Nicole and Gianna said, but it's also, in the real world, there needs to be a lot of communication back and forth through email is really kind of the most realistic thing. And when there's open communication prior to the IEP meeting about some of the overall goals, maybe that the family is looking for, it helps to come together as a team at the, the official meeting. And it goes a little bit smoother when there's an ongoing communication that happens throughout the year, really.
Yeah, and I think that ongoing communication is something that we're starting to really, remember or reinforce as essential for effective development of IEPs. It's not let's wait till the end of the year, let's do all our testing, and then get it done. It's really around this evolving process, and I'm glad that you sort of reinforce that. Now, Bart, as an administrator, how does your role ensure that we are sort of taking these processes and developing this comprehensive statement?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the critical piece is a SPED director just overseeing that process and recognizing that, and again, it was mentioned before, it happens long before the IEP. So even starting with that problem-solving team referral, making sure the problem-solving team practices are in place, that the referral for special education is appropriate and informational, that the evaluation is comprehensive. So I think as a SPED director, just making sure that each of those pieces really are building and providing information as we get to that comprehensive statement of services. That's one area. The other area is, I think it's really important to provide context and forum for these discussions. So as I'm having my team meetings, being sure I'm using those opportunities to reinforce that idea of the interrelated nature of these activities, and then helping people understand how they can communicate what they need to communicate that will really help us build those comprehensive statements. So those are the two areas that I really would focus on.
Yeah, and I think something else that we have talked about is the professional learning is that sometimes, and we kind of saw it in the chat box, it sounds like certain people know certain parts of the statement. And if you're trying to develop a comprehensive statement, that means we all have to understand how the parts go together. So I'm curious, just from your roles, and I'll start with you, Andrea, how do we encourage this greater understanding of how all of the parts fit together? So it's not just the, school psych puts their part in and, OT puts their part in, and then we show up and sign off on it.
Yeah, so what we recommend in our district is the use of the Student Environment Task and Tools Framework, which was developed by Joy Zabala. And I think that's a great starting point when really thinking about how interconnected all of these pieces are. And it really helps to develop that collaboration. So that way everybody can bring their lens and their areas and expertise when we're thinking about the student's strengths and areas of concerns, the environments that are impacted, tasks that are challenging for the student, thinking about what students are required to do in this educational environment, and then some potential tools that can help. So it brings in everyone's strengths, expertise, opinions, and it also makes sure the parents' voices are heard. And then once we've had that discussion across all the areas, we can see that there's different pieces of that statement that may show up depending on the strengths and needs of the students, the environment. So it may turn into program modifications. It may turn into some strategies and evidence-based practices that we're embedded in the IEP. It may be specific assistive technology tools or other supports that the student requires. So we recommend just using that framework to start that conversation and then see based on their endpoint where that would appear within the statement in the IEP.
Excellent. Now we have a question that came from our chat box, and it's in reference to interpreters. We have a couple of on the call today. Do your interpreters participate as professionals within these discussions? And do they contribute to the development of the statement? And so I don't know if either any of you want to take a chance. Otherwise, I'll sort of pin this on Nicole as a first start.
Hi. So, first of all, if there's an interpreter present because the parent and the family speaks another language in the home or their native language, then, their interpreters are going to be there regardless functionally, to make sure that we're pausing, that information is getting back and forth the way it needs to in that realm. But also then they are a professional at the table. And so particularly, they might, I guess I would say, well, what is the language proficiency of the student? So if the student is already a proficient English speaker, then, maybe the interpreter is there only functionally for the family and the communicative access. But if the student is also learning English, I'm thinking, well, if the English language specialist is there and sort of bringing that lens, I think the bottom line is the IEP table needs to be a friendly and welcoming place to anybody who's there, and everybody has something to offer. So if it was me, I don't turn away anyone's professional judgment.
And it sounds like, and in the chat box, you can clarify, is there might actually be some interpreters for sign language, is that as well, and where that might be a service that's being offered to the student. And I would think, of course, they would be part of these conversations because they make up the comprehensive set of services that are available to students. And we did get a question about the framework, and we've dropped that in the chat box. Yes, thanks, Colleen, is clarifying is around deaf as interpreters for the deaf as a related service provider. So. Yeah, and I think that comes along with, we had several related service providers on the call, is that they should always be part of the conversation. So. Okay. All right, and so this is for Emma and Gianna. It says, how do you work collaboratively? And so this might come back to that question we just heard is, how do you physically work together? What are some of the things that are important for you as a service provider to keep in mind to work with other service providers? And Emma, I'll start with.
Okay, so I have the benefit of seeing Gianna, when I'm working with our shared student. So that helps with the collaboration, but I think it's really what's the most essential thing to remember is considering our different scopes of practice and then problem solving together when there needs to be either a problem solved or just we want to move forward to identify goals. And to be willing to kind of be flexible in that problem solving, as well as awareness maybe of personal weaknesses in the profession and how you can seek support from the other and within their field and what they can bring to the table.
Gianna?
Short, to reinforce what Emma was speaking to, I think just willingness of all team members to learn from one another and to be open and accepting of their own weaknesses. And we do have a recent example of my own weakness, if I could share that. We were taking some data on mask tolerance and increasing the duration of time that the mask was being tolerated for. And I had put my BCBA hat on and suggested that there be maybe a creation of a button on the AAC for, may I remove my mask? And I had suggested maybe that be on the home page in thinking of learning and immediacy and the learning history of this particular student. And Emma shared her expertise, which made a whole lot of sense, and said, this is where it should go. And the student is sophisticated enough to find it, through this pathway. And I think that open communication is only, we all have the same goal for this particular student, for every student, right? But we all have a different expertise. So that just particular example and the ability to communicate that and make it happen for the next day, or sometimes 30 minutes from the conversation for this particular student, it really helps him get through the day and access reinforcement and be independent and happy. So the willingness and the communication, I think, is really important.
Can I just give them a shout out too from the other end? That day, I heard about that as a parent, that button was added, and that if we're out in the community and he seems to be pulling at his mask, that this was in there so that now I can ensure it. So I wanted to say two things: communication, that frequent checking in, but also the way that we write these things, it's a global communication thing, right? So we want to, but they're very live time in vivo, implementing it in all different ways all the time.
And go ahead, Emma.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I agree in communication and flexibility, but without trust, I think for Gianna to put that out there in an email and for me to trust that she knew that I was going to give feedback and that I knew that when I gave my feedback, it would be taken and listened to, is if you don't have that trust, then you're kind of dead in the water, because then it can become more frustration. There's more frustration, and then therefore communication kind of may suffer, and therefore the ball doesn't continue to roll.
Yeah. And it sounds like what you're reinforcing is that there's no one entity, whether it's the special ed teacher, the parent, the related service provider, has all the answers. And I think that's what's so cool about this statement, right? Is it actually is forcing us to come together with our collective expertise and say, how can we combine that to meet the individualized needs for this student? And knowing that it's going to be a discussion. I don't have to come with all the answers, is that I'm coming with my knowledge and expertise of my practice and the student, and then we work together to figure out how do we make this a good statement for this student. Welcome back, Bart. We missed you there for a second. That's okay. Well, and Andrea, I'm curious, thinking about your work as an AT specialist, your work kind of falls across, it's not necessarily in one part of it. So how is it that you ensure that assistive technology is reflected across each of those parts?
Yes, so after we support teams with the initial recommendations, they tend to have a lot of questions. And one of it is, where does this go in the IEP? So we kind of break it up to say, okay, if it's a low-tech solution, many of the low-tech solutions overlap with evidence-based practices, and then that can go in the special education piece of it, and we can embed some of those strategies in the goals, present levels of performance, because we know this is what the student needs to access the curriculum. And then there's other highly specialized tools like high-tech AAC systems that are required for the student's communication needs, and we may put that in the services and supplemental aid section of the IEP because the child requires that piece to access the curriculum. And I always remind teams to write this so clear that if the student transfers to another classroom or another district, we know exactly where these pieces go and how it all fits together to help the student. But assistive technology is very broad. So we start with the recommendations. And what I typically recommend is the development of an implementation plan as well. So we can really see if the student is using this tool, this is how it can look when they're integrating it in the classroom. And we use that implementation plan to determine where that would fall within the IEP based on how it would be used and how the student would access the tool.
Yeah, I can see that you need specially designed instruction to utilize the tool. The teacher might need some, program modifications to the class or their training. So it really does fall across. And I think that's confusing for teachers in the development is we're really focused on where it goes, right, in our IEP. But as we've kind of talked about today, it really is this comprehensive statement. And it's okay that it goes across as long as it sounds like what you're saying is very clearly defined what we're offering for the student.
Yes.
Now, Bart, I'm sure you've seen some challenges as as you've gone across multiple teams in this implementation. And I'm curious what some of those challenges you're seeing and what are some of the recommendations or tips that you've used or would recommend for people to avoid those challenges?
Yeah, and I've worked with great teams, highly skilled people. I think the structure and processes in special ed are a little bit of a double-edged sword. And by that, I mean, the structure helps us get to this comprehensive statement of services, but often it's so repetitive that I think people build habits sometimes that, and with no ill intent, just stop kind of seeing the student as an individual student. They just get in their habits of how they're building these statements, the services they're offering, things like that. So I think that's the primary challenge, is just constantly reinforcing that idea, reteaching that idea that each student is an individual, and making sure the team is approaching each student however many times a year with that fresh mindset. People know the answers. It's just about, hey, let's really make sure we're doing the mental work to problem solve what is needed for the student, problem solve the communication piece, all of that to make sure that it's really dialed in. I don't know that there's any silver bullet for that or any sexy answer. I think it's just about that continual conversation. Again, how are we making sure that these are individualized services? How are we making sure that we're communicating? And even though teams maybe get tired of those, quote unquote, simple conversations, I think they're absolutely necessary to make sure that we're getting to where we need to go and students are getting what they need. So.
And Nicole, you mentioned something that makes me think is to address that particular issue is we start every conversation is what do we want, right? What do we want for this child from the family, the school's perspective? Because if we have that focus, right, then it becomes the kid and not the process that we're looking at. Now we're coming close to time, but I want to give each of you an opportunity to share a tip or a trick or something that you think is really important for folks to know as they move forward in thinking about the development of this statement. And Andrea, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Emma, Nicole, Deanna, and Bart.
Yeah, so one thing I recommend, and Nicole mentioned this earlier, was starting with what we want for the student and always thinking beyond graduation. So I think sometimes teams think about this school year or this quarter, but we really need to think about where we want the student to go and the life that everyone wants this child to have once they graduate. And the tip or resource I mentioned earlier that I think has been so helpful in the development of these statements is the Student Environment Task and Tools framework, or the SEC framework. That gives everyone a very good starting point. It appears to be very systematic, and people like things that seem to be very systematic, but it's a great starting point for the conversation of what does the student need to access the curriculum.
Thanks, Andrea. Emma.
I think probably the best tip that I could offer is being willing to think out of the box, and that with flexibility, willing to co-treat with others and collaborate on goals when writing that part of the IEP, to think about it in that out of the box way.
All right, Nicole.
So if I think about the parent lens and the tips that I have for parents is, as Andrea mentioned, even when my son was in kindergarten, I started the IEP with, we believe he will need assistance his whole life. But here's our goal for a functional level of independence that we are looking for him, right? Which quickly moved us to the areas of AAC and communication, of independence, and a functional level of reading. And then I said, and this team, we wrap around these 3 problems. And I would just say that, I shouldn't say problems, areas of focus. And I would say that, I think a lot of parents are a little intimidated to do that, or they don't think it's their role. And I would really encourage you to say what you need. Another example, just as a side one, is every year since he was a baby, I say, I want the general education students trained on him. When he does this, what does it mean? When he makes noises, what does it mean? And if it's developmentally appropriate to use the term autism, I, as a parent, I ask for it. And then I explain to the team that what happens when I'm out in the community is, if we train the kids, they come up and they say hi to him, and then they wait because they know he's got to find his talker, right? And if we don't do that, they're uncomfortable around him, they stare, and their parents take them away. And I said, that's not the life I want for him, right? I want this life where kids in this community know him. Parents, you got to speak up.
Thanks, Nicole. Gianna.
Okay. Well, I guess as a BCBA and collecting data, that's what we're good at. That's what we do. But the analytic piece, I think, is really helpful when we're trying to increase independence. And I think in my experience, at least, if I'm working with a student and that student has been working on the same skill for at a length of time that I'm not comfortable with, then I need to change what I'm doing. I have no control over that student's behavior, but I do have control over my behavior, and I can modify what I'm doing in order to make it, less prescriptive, less like a menu that, one size fits all, and more individualized and capitalizing on their strengths. I guess that would be my nugget, is I have to change my behavior in order for this student to be able to succeed.
Thanks for sharing that. And Bart, you're going to close out our panel. What's your tip for success?
My tip for success is really about structuring staffings or assessment planning meetings, making sure that, and I'm not, I want to avoid predetermination like the plague, right? For sure. But I do think when we have staffings where we're preparing, proposed IEP, where we're talking about present levels, really making sure that those are productive, and that the team, before they're discussing the evaluation or the proposed IEP with the parent, getting their input, that they're really dialed in on what the student needs. Again, individual planning, just making that effective so that they know what they're talking about. So it makes sense for the parent. The parent can come in again, give input, and a good decision can be made for a plan moving forward based on that comprehensive statement of services.
Great. Go, Nicole.
I'm so sorry. Can I just say one more thing? And this conversation reminded me too that administratively, I've noticed as a parent, because I have 2 different children, that schools that loop their special needs teachers and related providers, I feel have more of their infrastructure to do this well. So I just wanted to put that out there. And they don't have providers that are spread across multiple buildings because that limits collaboration, communication, and the ability to be responsive.
Yeah, and I think Colleen's given a big yes for that, because if we don't have the infrastructure to support our ability to to collaborate and meet, it sounds good on paper, but it doesn't ever really make it to practice. So thanks for closing us out with that, Nicole. So in the chat box, feel free, there's a little emoticon smiley face. You can give a round of applause for our panel. So thank you all very much. We're going to close out today with a couple of resources, and we'll also be putting in the chat our evaluation for today. As I mentioned, this is just the first in a number of professional development opportunities that we have for folks. There's a lot of places to learn more. And on the next slide, you will see that we have a Path to Progress podcast that's coming up. We have a number of educators and residents who are on with the center for a year, and they come from all different levels of the system. And so they are discussing hot topics. You can find that link in the chat box, but also on our website. It's just more of a fun way to hear about educators in the field discussing these topics. Our next one is our tip sheets, which you heard about today. We have a number of tip sheets specifically around this statement. And because it's much more complex, you'll find 4 additional supplemental tip sheets to help you knock down each of those parts. And some of you mentioned program modification, supplementary aids and services. You will see a specific tip sheet for that. We also do, and you'll see Andrea was here today, we have a number of folks who are doing some of our stories from the classrooms and sharing what does it really look like in practice. So check out our stories from the classrooms. There will be some supplemental materials over time that support each of those that you can use them in your staff meetings to really start some of those discussions and talk about how does this apply to the local setting. And then there are additional resources from other centers. Stephen mentioned a couple of these. The National Center on Intensive Intervention, which is in its 3rd iteration of funding, offers a number of resources to help you in the design of specially designed instruction, thinking about how you collaborate or coordinate your teaming meetings. And there are also a number of high leverage practices that are used across all of those 4 parts for implementation. You can see the links in the chat box. We also heard about the IRIS Center today. SIPR, we have a number of national resources that we'll be sharing across this next year to help you with various parts of it, whether it's an accommodation or a modification, or if the student needs some different type of assistive technology or any related services. There are additional supports on the IRIS Center website. And so just a couple of more, and I mentioned the Parent Center, and then we'll go to the next one. And then if you are looking, there are so many free national resources that are out there. There's the Deaf Blind Project. There is our interpreter, or that have resources for interpreters and designing specially designed instruction in those areas. But there are also other centers that work with various groups, learning needs and types of resources. And I'll just close this out by thanking you for attending today. As always, we appreciate you taking the time. Please consider following us to hear about all the new resources, including our tip sheets and podcasts and other online training modules that will be coming out over the year. But either on Facebook or Twitter, you can find us at K-12 Progress, and on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to having further conversations. And thanks again to our panelists and Stephen for sharing their knowledge and expertise.